latest episode of Tucker Carlson's Twitter show, he makes the case that RFK Jr. is winning.
A new Economist poll shows that Kennedy is more popular and far less hated than either major party frontrunner. After almost 20 years of being silenced, Bobby Kennedy Jr. is being heard. And why wouldn't he be? Kennedy's theories about vaccines may be right, they may be partially right, they could be even utterly wrong. No one's proved it either way. But what we can say with certainty is that America's medical establishment has beclowned itself for all time. Its official positions on vaccines, psychiatric drugs, puberty blockers, reassignment surgeries, a long list of other politically fashionable priorities have no connection whatsoever to legitimate science. It's all effectively witchcraft. At the annual meeting of the American Medical Association in Chicago last week, for example, delegates issued a statement attacking the body mass index as a tool of, quote, racist exclusion, which has caused historical harm. Next year, they will denounce thermometers and stethoscopes. They're insane. Compared to them, Bobby Kennedy is a mainstream figure, and people understand that. That's why he's winning.
Wall Street Journal reporter Eliza Collins tweeted yesterday, JFK Jr. stood in front of a statue of President Kennedy at the site marking his uncle's first stop in the 1960 campaign. Then he defended his claim that a contaminant in water might be causing people to identify as transgender. Semaphore reporter Dave Weigel tweeted in reply, "For who is wondering, the Biden admin is trying to limit the use of that chemical, and most opposition is coming from Republicans."
Weigel shared the Kennedy campaign statement on Biden's push. Quote, Mr. Kennedy is a strong advocate of restrictions on atrazine. He applauds the Biden administration's move and favors even stronger restrictions. Not much disagreement between them here. Kennedy just talks about it more. Semaphore reporter Dave Weigel joins us now to discuss. So, Dave, I can't help but mention that, of course, this was a claim that goes back to the days of Alex Jones at InfoWars talking about the water turning the frogs gay. Now, somehow, the political parties or partisan factions have flipped on who is taking atrazine seriously. I mean, what is going on here?
Yeah, and that's a good example of how a lot of what Kennedy is running on when it comes to environmental regulation. And remember, that's how he got into vaccine skepticism. That's how he got into the issues that censored him, was through environmental lawsuits protecting the climate, cleaning up water supplies. Democrats do that stuff. Where they disagree is on the implications that, like with Jones, that the chemicals in this water supply are the reasons that gender dysphoria exists, for one. That is not proven. That there's studies about frogs, there's not studies about how it affects humans. But Kennedy, I think, has picked up, you might even say, the popular side of the argument and saying it's not just that these chemicals are bad and poisonous, that we need to take them out of the water supply. It's that they might even be responsible for gender dysphoria. That is, I think, a position, as you correctly said, that was you didn't say fringes, but I can say Alex Jones, somebody who's been demonetized, kicked off YouTube. It's a pretty fringe position, an example of something that Kennedy has elevated into the presidential.
So is Biden not talking about it? Do you think a signal that he finds it a less important issue? Because it sounds like RFK Jr. has been, pleased with the Biden administration taking the use of atrazine seriously. So is this a distinction between the two candidates, or do you think RFK Jr. talks about it just in a way that lands with more voters?
I think it's the latter. The point I was making, because I didn't see another reporter ask the Kennedy campaign what they thought, was that the current Republican Party, for whoever might be the biggest voice in the room at the moment, it does believe in deregulation. It does take, in this case, the side of the agricultural lobby and the farm bureau that want to be able to use herbicides that contain this chemical. It takes their side. It wants to get rid of red tape. It wants to get rid of the waters of the United States, et cetera, et cetera. The Biden administration, like the Obama administration, like Democrats really in the last 50 years, believes in regulation, but it does not believe in, it wouldn't comment on this, but it doesn't believe in the implications that I think, a great example here, that it get people excited. If you tell a room of people, hey, there's this chemical that we think is a little bit dangerous and farmers are using it in Iowa, maybe people's eyes don't perk up. If you say, and we think it might be causing gender dysphoria, then they perk up. And that is the thing I think, just object to what Tucker Carlson was talking about, getting the media's attention, breaking through the veil, getting the people's attention past the media veil that is what Kennedy has been doing. Stuff that really you could find on the internet 15 years ago, but you maybe were not finding. Definitely, we're not finding in a presidential campaign. We're not finding in a CNN town hall, things like that. Democrats are not running on that harm, that possible harm, that alleged harm from this chemical. They just believe in environmental regulation, and the way that Kennedy has talked about it, I think, good example of how he's saying something that might appeal to conservatives who are not interested, or when they hear the EPA is doing something, their instinct is, well, that must be oppressing people's rights to farm.
Yeah, I want to bring in a little bit more of the specifics of what RFK Jr. is saying so we can hear directly from him. He talked about this on the Jordan Peterson podcast, saying that chemicals in drinking water can impact, quote, sexual dysphoria. Let's listen.
I see these huge levels of depression and despair, loneliness in kids, and I don't think that there's a single cause to it. And I think blaming it on, depression about climate is probably oversimplistic. And in fact, I think a lot of the problems we see in kids, and particularly boys, it's probably underappreciated that how much of that is coming from chemical exposures, including a lot of the sexual dysphoria that we're seeing. They're swimming through a soup of toxic chemicals today, and many of those are endocrine disruptors. There's atrazine throughout our water supply. Atrazine, by the way, if you in a lab put atrazine in a tank full of frogs, it will chemically castrate and forcibly feminize every frog in there, and 10% of the frogs, the male frogs, will turn into fully viable females able to produce viable eggs. If it's doing that to frogs, there's a lot of other evidence that it's doing it to human beings as well.
Matt Iglesias tweeted, Trump turned your kids trans by weakening Clean Water Act rules. We want to add, claims that chemicals cause sexual dysphoria are not proven. But Dave, I know it sounds conspiratorial, but I remember, years ago, people were debating about whether fluoride in the water was good for your kids. There's been a ton of movement on the right about seed oils and soy and all kinds of other things related to nutrition. So it kind of makes me wonder, is food the new front of politics?
Well, you're right that this was a shift. If I landed in Marin County, California in 1998, and I started talking to people about why are so many kids allergic to peanuts now? Why is there so much more depression? Why is autism increased? It was a very popular discourse among liberals and people on the left. But look, we all know that the companies are dumping chemicals in the water. That's got to be behind this. The Democratic Party has adopted that as policy. They want to get as many chemicals as possible out of the water. It's a scandal when we find a company who's been doing and want to deregulate. But what happened, and really was, I think Carlson points this out, COVID that supercharged this, is that things flipped. Liberals and left, and I think largely we could say, look at polling people on the left, believe in the CDC. They believe when the government scientists say something that is accurate. If you're suing in court, the judge is going to say the same thing. Hey, this plaintiff says something about this chemical, but I checked the CDC and they say it's not true. But on the right, that skepticism has mushroomed, and that is what Kennedy is doing. His polling has been pretty stable. It's not clear he's picking up people. What he's doing is really resurrecting this line of thought that was very popular among liberals before COVID. Really, the kind of, I would say, even pushing it back before that, the vaccine skeptic movement, very popular on the left, very popular in California. You look back at where vaccine hesitance was the highest when mothers letting their kids get vaccinated. It was in liberal areas until the Trump era, and that's what Kennedy's talking about. I think it forced it to some extent into the presidential race. It was a legitimate issue. It's not being seen as a legitimate issue anymore. But what happens if you're the president and you are getting past the mainstream media filter by going on a very popular podcast? Peterson has 7 million subscribers. You can get this into the conversation again. I mean, whatever happens to Kennedy, this is one of the goals he had that he's succeeding on, is changing the discussion and reintroducing topics that were censored for a lot of media for a very long time. And some of them were censored, I think, for good reasons, because people were looking at the data and saying, this is incorrect. You cut this part of the quote out. You cut this research out. It's a Wild West has a pejorative sense to it, but it is a bit more of a Wild West now. You cannot stop information from getting out there if all the networks say we're not going to print it. You can go on a podcast, it's very popular, and people react as we're reacting right now, as Democrats react to Kennedy.
Unfortunately, we're completely out of time, but Dave Weigel from Semaphore, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
More Rising after this.